Hello, I'm Kate Power and I'm a lecturer in the University of Queensland Business School. Today I'm going to share with you some research that I've done looking at transgendering the academy by incorporating trans content into non-specialist courses. I'm going to start by drawing a little bit on a book chapter that I've written recently, which is expected to be published later this year. That looks at a case study of a required first-year academic research and writing course at a university in Canada, which I taught for several years. And then I'm going to cut to a pre-recorded interview with the instructor of this course, one of my colleagues from the university I used to work at in Canada. And then I'm going to finish up with some ideas about how UQ instructors and possibly instructors at other universities might like to consider what they could do in their own classes to make the university a more accommodating place for trans students. I want to first acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera people who are the traditional owners of the land. This place, this location, has been a space in which teaching and research and learning and collaboration have happened for many thousands of years before there was ever a university here. And so on behalf of the UQ Ally Network and myself, I want to pay my respects to the ancestors of the traditional owners and their descendants. Now, when students enter university for the first time, they face several challenges. And one of the big challenges is coming to grips with academic culture. And this is especially important because, at least for the duration of your degree program, as a student, you really need to find a way to develop and communicate your identity in ways that are acknowledged and respected. And this involves acquiring a lot of new knowledge, a lot of which is often left tacit by instructors. And so new students, and even honestly new faculty, can feel quite ill at ease when they first arrive at the university because they need to get to grips with not only the scholarly conventions that are common across the university, but individual disciplines often have their own particular requirements, conventions, and expectations. And if faculty and students are moving across disciplines, this can be particularly challenging. We all have to go through a process of socialisation into the university culture and into our disciplinary norms. And there are expert gatekeepers. They might be instructors, they might be journal editors or funding agencies who have the authority to judge the work that we produce. That might be assignments, it could be written journal articles or grant applications. And the judgments of these gatekeepers can have material consequences for us. So passing or failing grades, getting published in a journal that you really need to be published in for your academic reputation. Sometimes promotion is contingent upon being published in certain journals, and securing or not securing research funds. Quite a lot of academics' employment depends on securing grant after grant after grant. Now, research tells us that academic success can be more difficult for students whose identities sit uneasily alongside those endorsed by the university. We know that gender and sexual minority students often experience educational contexts as hostile, and we know that this can have negative consequences for their learning outcomes. LGBTQI students may feel compelled to hide their sexual orientation and/or their gender identity, and several studies have shown that they consider abandoning their studies more often or at higher rates than other students. People experiencing any kind of coming out process may also find that exploring their sexuality leaves them with little residual energy or motivation for academic study. Now, while there has been relatively little research to date into trans students' experiences at university, it seems that trans students are especially vulnerable to these challenges. They experience harassment at higher levels than their cisgender counterparts, and many universities fail to provide trans students with tailored institutional support. To borrow terminology from Pauline Park, there are lots of ways to transgender the academy, including dedicated faculty appointments, support services, and changes to the curriculum. In 2016, for example, the University of Victoria in Canada appointed the world's first chair in transgender studies, Dr Aaron DeVore. This was a huge accomplishment, made possible in part by the fact that, relatively speaking, Canada is a pretty good place to be for LGBTQI people. Same-sex marriage was legalised in 2005, so 15 years ago. An Anglican bishop in Vancouver was one of the first in the world to bless same-sex marriages. This was in 2002, 3 years before they were legal. In March 2015, the Vancouver Parks Board, which runs all of the public swimming pools in the city, as well as all of the public play and park spaces, began a high-profile public awareness campaign. One of the posters is on the screen right now, promoting new trans-inclusive bathrooms and change rooms, so 5 years ago. And in 2017, Prime Minister Trudeau made good on one of his election campaign promises by tabling legislation to ensure, quote, the full protection of transgender people. And Bill C-16, again I'm quoting, enshrines the rights of transgender or gender diverse Canadians by including them under human rights and hate crime laws. So at least institutionally, public institutions are displaying a fairly high level of support. And according to Prime Minister Trudeau, Vancouver must set an example to the rest of the world that hate speech and transphobia are simply unacceptable. Now, as a member of faculty and an instructor, one of the most obvious ways to transgender the academy is to incorporate trans issues and perspectives into the curriculum. And obviously, we could try to do this by creating dedicated courses that are focused on gender diversity. The number of these kinds of transgender-related university courses around the world has increased quite rapidly in recent years, but Park's research shows that the overall number of specialist courses is still very small, and these courses tend to be taught by adjunct or casual instructors who have, quoting Park, little institutional influence and limited ability to ensure continuity in course content from semester to semester. That's the end of the quote. Now, depending on the specific university context, it can be surprisingly difficult to create new courses. And given the current situation of higher education in Australia, universities are unlikely to be taking risks on new courses that may not pay their way. However, as my recent book chapter points out, adjusting a wide range of non-specialist courses can be an effective way of achieving a more inclusive curriculum. Indeed, non-specialist courses, particularly if they're required courses that students take at the beginning of their degree program, can be a powerful and strategic location in which to position transgender studies for maximum effect. I'll cut now to the interview part of this presentation, which focuses on an example of how this has been done, incorporating trans studies within a first-year required academic research and writing course at the University of British Columbia. I taught research and writing at UBC for 7 years before joining UQ. And in one of the courses I taught, faculty were free to teach research and writing through the lens of other topics. And the course area topic, was chosen by the instructor. So my course area topics were international development and religion, which are two interests of mine. But my colleague, Dr Mary Ann Saunders, taught the same basic content about research and writing through the lens of transgender studies. And she kindly allowed me to do research with her students, which is the basis of my book chapter. So let's switch now to my interview with Mary Ann.
Thanks for joining me, Mary Ann. It's great seeing your face again 2.5 years after I moved to Brisbane from Vancouver. Perhaps you could introduce yourself to our viewers, maybe your name, your role at UBC, and the First Nations country you're working from today.
So my name is Mary Ann Saunders. I'll start by saying that I'm an uninvited guest on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'm very grateful for their stewardship of the land and grateful to be here on it. As I said, my name is Mary Ann Saunders. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. At UBC, I am a lecturer in a program called Arts Studies in Research and Writing, although we don't just do arts stuff anymore, so that name will probably change, which is an academic writing unit, specializes in teaching academic writing. And I also do some teaching in the Department of English Language and Literatures as well. Teach some literature courses.
In the past, I've heard you say that your coming out journey was a little bit different to what other trans people experience. Could you share a bit of that journey with us, including what it was like coming out as a trans faculty member, and also, if you're willing, a little bit about your experience with religion?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to talk about those. The first thing I would say is that I'm not sure I would say exactly my journey is unlike that of many other trans people, as much as my experiences don't fall into the standard trans narratives, because I'm becoming increasingly convinced that, in fact, in some ways, my experience is not that unusual. It's just that we're not supposed to talk about these things because somehow it creates, I don't know, it disrupts a variety of norms. But I think it's important for us to be able to talk openly about our experiences. So that's why I always have. So my own story of kind of coming into knowledge of my own transness came about in an interesting way. I had been for a long time what I would have thought of as a heterosexual cross-dresser, although I didn't really like those terms, but I didn't have better terms for it. But I didn't really have a sense of myself as a woman, or but I also knew that whatever I was, it wasn't a man. It was a really odd place to be in some ways. And and in circumstances that I won't go into any detail about, but about somewhere between 15 and 20 years ago, because of these circumstances, I really became aware that there was a child self who was a girl who was about 8 years old. And when I started kind of finding her and discovering her and exploring her own possibilities, that was the first time I really had a sense of myself as female, as opposed to before, kind of like being being a man who liked to wear women's clothing. And interestingly, in my own history, in my own childhood, it was right around the time I was 8 or 9 that I started to have an understanding that the ways in which I enacted gender were not considered by my peers to be gender appropriate. So there's something I think that I lost then. And so I had several years of just kind of getting to know this child self who was a girl. And eventually, interestingly enough, after about 8 or 9 years, so when I would have been, chronologically, say 9 years old, that started to not work for me anymore. And then I started to move towards something that was more of an adult self, and that just naturally developed into gender transition. So there was like this action of going back and finding and rescuing my child self, um, and nurturing her so that she could grow up into the person who you see now. And as for religion, I am a lifelong Anglican. There were a number of years, I think, where a lot of us fall away from the church, but eventually life circumstances brought me back. And I was really fortunate to, and am still really fortunate to be part of a congregation and a community of faith, which is very it really embraced me as I transitioned, and really honored and nurtured and supported me in ways that I hadn't necessarily expected, but I was really grateful for. And I've done work since then in that community on making it an even more kind of trans and gender diverse, inclusive, and friendly community. I know there are some people who've come to us in part because of the work that I have done there, and I'm really grateful for that. Also, being faculty member at UBC, which was remarkably uneventful. My transition was remarkably uneventful, remarkably smooth. I was off teaching for a couple of months one summer, and I came back as someone different from who I left as. And all the head of the English department said when I went to tell him about this, you know, as a woman, he just remarked, "Well, I think I would have noticed," and then and then offered to help me with anything I needed, any help I needed for, you know, changing my records, you know, all those administrative stuff at the university. He supported me in that. And over in ASRW, at our first meeting of the year, you know, people were just saying to me things like, "Well, we wondered when you were going to get around to this." So, you know, because I've been studying trans stuff for a long time, right? There was not really a surprise to people that that my life would have taken this turn, and people were aware that this was something I had been an area I'd been working in. So it was just like, "Oh, look, finally." So that was lovely. And I've really experienced a lot of support. Right now, I'm on a task force which is looking into the things that UBC needs to do to really, truly become a place that is welcoming of and supports transgender and two-spirit and non-binary members of the community, whether faculty, staff, students, what have you.
So let's think about courses now. I know that you teach and have taught some courses which are sort of focused on trans studies or have a prominent reason for incorporating trans studies. And then some other disciplinary courses where it's been your choice and you've been able to incorporate trans studies even though it wasn't necessarily the focus of the course. So could you just briefly tell us the range of courses where you've been able to bring in trans studies?
When I first started teaching our first year writing studies course, those courses are themed courses so that the students are learning about academic writing through looking at a particular theme from a variety of perspectives, by a variety of disciplinary and research perspectives. And I, from the start, made my course a trans studies course, so that one where the theme was trans studies. So, so that one is not a specialist course. And also, some of my literature courses have been courses where I just have included literature by trans writers or featuring trans characters. I'm also a children's literature specialist, and I teach quite a bit of children's literature. And that's been a place where I've brought in fiction about or for trans youth and children. And in the fall, I'm going to be teaching UBC English department's first ever majors seminar in trans literatures. I'm really looking forward to that. I'm very excited about it. And I also was the first person to teach. We have a unit called the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at UBC. And I taught the Institute's, designed and taught the Institute's very first Introduction to Trans Studies course, which I taught twice. And then because of the way the terms of my employment worked, it was difficult for me to continue teaching there, but it has since then been taught by another faculty member who is doing a great job with it. Yeah.
Like all academic fields, trans studies has evolved and is continuing to evolve. So over that period of time, a decade or more that you've been incorporating trans studies into your academic classrooms, you've watched the field evolve. What are some of the questions that are pertinent or important to trans studies today?
That's a great question. And, you know, when I was thinking about it, I thought, well, a really decent way to have a gauge of this would be to go and look at Transgender Studies Quarterly, which is the journal of record for trans studies. And obviously there would be other things going on that are outside of that wouldn't necessarily be in the journal. But interestingly, the most recent issue of Trans Studies Quarterly is a special focusing on trans pornography, which might seem in some ways like a kind of a funny answer to what questions or issues are central in the field. But when you stop to think about it, it actually kind of makes sense in as much as for some time trans studies has been moving away from, you know, questions of identity, which were of interest early on in trans studies research, and towards topics that cover a much fuller range of human experiences. And of course, like most people, trans people are sexual beings, right? But we're not often thought of as sexually desirable by the general population. And we know this through surveys and research. So examining what we might call the trans erotic would seem to be an important area of study. So that was interesting to me. Some other important current areas seem to be transcultural production. There's been a real explosion in art, literature, media by trans people in the last decade or so, and so that's being looked at, as well as really important kind of humanitarian areas. Think questions like, you know, for example, with refugee crises seemingly everywhere right now. You know, questions around what happens to trans and gender diverse people who are caught up in these crises, trans and gender diverse people who are also migrants. And just generally, there's an increasing focus on, and the field is really trying to pay attention to Black, Brown, and Indigenous trans lives or instances of gender diversity, as well as trans lives in the global South. As well as distinctness of local kinds of histories and traditions that come with their own kind of rich set of terms and histories that don't fall easily under this Western rubric of transgender, but still look like gender diversity. So that's another one. And just to blow my own horn for a moment, I would tell you about two things I'm working on. Because one of them is, and I'm working on these projects with colleagues, one of them is concerned with the ways that ideas of gender get mobilized in research on facial recognition technologies. And while we're considering gender broadly, we're also thinking about transgender in that research, because trans people are really understood to disrupt these technologies. Yay us. So we're doing work on that, and another project I'm working on with a colleague is about ways that histories of trans-related trauma seem to underpin fiction for pre-adolescent youth that has been written by trans authors and which have trans characters in them. And this one comes really out of, my interest in this comes out of my own intimate experience of reading these books, which started triggering my own trauma responses to memories of my own childhood, right? And you don't think of books written for, you young people who are, say, 7 to 10 years old as books that would leave you shaking, shivering, weeping. But I don't think this is the effect they have on your average person, but that's the effect they have on me. So I became interested in the ways that these histories of trauma seem to be just there below the surface of these books.
We want to see when those research projects come to a head and we can get access to your good work. So we've got a little bit about you and a little bit about the courses that you've taught and a little bit about trans studies as a field. What motivates you, or what are your goals when you're wanting to embed trans studies into an academic classroom?
Often when you ask trans writers why they write, they will answer with some variation on this. They say, I wrote the book that I wish I'd had, in childhood, or at this point in my life, or that point in my life, right? So in a sense, I create my courses the way I do because they're the courses that I want to see. Right? They're the courses that I think that we need. And when I started doing this, it was in part because I couldn't see trans people and trans lives showing up anywhere in undergraduate curricula, except perhaps in pathologizing ways. In psych classes on deviant identities or whatever, right? And there really seemed to be a lack of institutional awareness and support around this. So in some ways, it started off as just kind of an insistence on making trans lives visible in undergraduate curricula, even if it seemed like my curricula were the only places where they were. And I think things are changing. There's a long way to go, but things are shifting around that, hence the working group that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which has just started up at UBC in the last few months. Another reason why is because students know what they want. And I have always had students say to me, why isn't anybody else teaching this stuff? Particularly when there's literature, there's a hunger for it. My majors seminar that I'm teaching in the fall filled up instantly. So I know that whatever departments and administrators are thinking, this is material that students are interested in. And so then some of the reasons why is, I said that things are shifting. I think things are shifting, and it's just great to be part of that shifting academic landscape, within it to be part of that movement towards a greater awareness of and inclusion of trans studies topics. And also, honestly, it feels good to be recognized for my expertise in terms of living up to in terms of lived experience, pedagogical innovation, research, that kind of thing. I also want my students to be able to develop an awareness of trans people's lives and experiences, to be able to distinguish what a good representation of a trans person is, say, in TV or whatever, from a bad or oppressive one. Since so much of media still continues to sensationalize trans lives. And I think that the last thing that I would say about this is that in my literature courses, there is so much great fiction and poetry that is being written by trans people these days. It's just been this extraordinary bursting forth of creativity in the last decade. And I want people to be reading those books. And I want literature departments to be teaching them and taking them seriously. And I do get queries from other professors and instructors in the English department saying, how do I incorporate these books into my courses? Or could you come and do a guest lecture in my classes? So there is that desire. So yeah, I think it's all about creating an environment where there is kind of an expectation that one would think about including this material in one's curricula, just the same way you would try to make your courses inclusive of a variety of racialized backgrounds or authors who come from a variety of that kind of lived experience. So that's a large part of the reason why I continue to do it.
With respect to your academic writing course, how has embedding trans studies affected that course?
In the writing studies course, or the academic writing course, using trans studies as the focus, one of the things that it does is that it allows me to help students develop a sense of what responsible and ethical research looks like in relation to marginalized and vulnerable communities. And in doing that, it also helps my students to reflect on their own subject positions as well. And it's not the same thing, but as a kind of a parallel or a corollary sort of situation. Most of the time, if you take the trouble to explain to someone why certain kinds of speech are, for example, racist or ableist, that'll make sense to them, unless they're really resistant to that kind of feedback. But people and students are really surprised to learn that a lot of their ordinary ways of thinking and speaking about trans people are inherently harmful, what we would call cis-centric and cis-sexist. So this really gives students an opportunity to think hard about their own subject positions in new ways, because they aren't even aware of how they're speaking and being in the world has these kinds of effects. And then what that subject position means in relation to a vulnerable community that most of them don't belong to, right? And another important aspect of the writing studies course in particular, and embedding trans studies in it, is that most students don't come into that course realizing that their writing course is going to have this focus, right? So it's different from going into a course where you're already expecting to be talking about trans studies. Most of those students don't know what's going to be there. And this has interesting effects. One is that each term I have students who come out to me as trans in that course. In some cases without having told any or very many other people before. And recently I had a student who told me they'd never seen another trans person before who was functioning in this kind of mentor role, or provided an example of the possibility for a trans person to be living a good and fulfilled and rich and happy life. This student hadn't seen that before. This trans student hadn't seen that before. And so for this student, my presence in a non-specialist course, right, just teaching a required first-year course was extraordinarily powerful. And implicitly, they told me, they didn't quite use these words, but implicit in what they said was that seeing me there in that role allowed them to imagine a future for themselves in a way that they hadn't been able to before.
That's fabulous. And that leads right into my next question. You've been doing this for roughly 10 or maybe a little bit more than 10 years, and you will have seen some of the challenges that students encounter when they come face to face with trans studies. But also, like you've also just mentioned, definite benefits. So could you elaborate a little bit on both of those?
One of the challenges that you would expect would be students who were resistant. And I'm not sure what the reason is, but I've had very little of that. And in most cases, those are students who've dropped out of the course fairly rapidly when they have been. Most of the students are just interested, curious. Some of them say, I don't know anything about this, and I think I'm not going to do well in the course because I don't know anything about it. And I always say to them, you'll be fine. Most of the other students in this room don't know much about it either. This is one of the great things about this as a theme for the course, is that you all come in on a more or less even playing field. So there is that kind of level of uncertainty. Another challenge, and I think this is particularly true at a university like UBC, where we have a lot of international students whose English is still developing. A challenge is to help students develop culturally competent ways of speaking and writing about trans lives. For someone whose English is still, I don't know what the right term is, but anyway, is still developing, understanding why saying that a person, as one example, saying why a person was assigned male at birth is okay. In fact, it is good, but saying they were born male is not. It can be challenging to grasp the nuance of the difference between assigned male at birth versus being born male. So that's so that kind of thing can be hard for some of the students. They find it really challenging, and inevitably I have to let some of that slide because there just isn't the time to do that work. But at the same time, I'm also aware that there's a good likelihood that there are trans and non-binary students in my classrooms who I'm not even aware of. They haven't told me they're trans or non-binary. Those kind of ways of speaking and writing, those stumbling, fumbling ways that the other students have, may well be experienced by them as harmful or even re-traumatizing in some way. And when I know students in those classes are trans, I'll say to them, look, this is going to happen in our course because everybody else in the room is trying to figure this stuff out and they don't have experience. And when I do that, the students are like, yeah, okay, thanks for the warning. But if I don't know, then I can't offer that warning. So there's a challenge here for the cisgender student, the non-trans student who is learning. There's a challenge here for the trans student who may have to hear things that are really uncomfortable and feel hurtful. And for me as the teacher in navigating all of this, wanting my classroom to be as safe as possible for my gender diverse students, while also being as patient as I can with those students who are trying to figure this stuff out. Because the one thing I don't want is for them to feel like they cannot speak or that they're being silenced. That's not at all productive. So those are some challenges. Do I have time to mention a benefit?
Yeah. Yes, please. We definitely want to hear about the benefits.
I think a real benefit for students in using trans studies as a focus specifically for their academic writing course, and at UBC the course is also an introduction to research culture, what research culture looks like, how we do research, what professional researchers do, and so on. In having trans studies as a focus for that, it really allows students to understand the breadth of places that research can go while still being about a specific research area. As a way of getting students to figure out what their own research projects are going to be, I ask them to reflect on their own lived experience, the things that are important to them. And as a consequence, I'll get students writing research papers on transgender athletes, on trans people in Asia, on how mindfulness meditation can help trans people negotiate the stresses of gender transition. I get students writing research papers on trans studies or trans people in scientific and technical disciplines, on trans childhoods and families, on trans people and mental health, on everything that touches on the student's own life. The ones who write about athletics tend to be athletes. The ones who write about mental health have often had their own struggles with mental health. The ones who write about childhood are often contemplating careers in education or some other field that is connected with children and childhood and so on. So then research becomes something that's not, it isn't something out there, but it's something that's intimate and real and relevant to the things that they care about. And trans lives become something that is not out there, but something that's connected and relevant to the things that they care about, often in surprisingly intimate ways. So yeah, that's a real benefit, I think.
Well, Mary Ann, let's finish up with just thinking some of our viewers, I think, are probably looking for ways to incorporate trans studies into their own classrooms. That's one of the goals of this video series, is to give people resources and raise awareness. Do you have any must-read books or pedagogical approaches that would be a good place for someone who's very new, who might want to do more in this area, that they could look to?
That's a really great question, and I'm not aware of anything yet that's been published specifically as a book in this area. But there are a few things I could suggest. One thing I would suggest is looking at Volume 2, Issue 3 of the Transgender Studies Quarterly. That's from 2015, but it's an issue that's given over to questions of trans pedagogies. It's called Transformative Pedagogies. Also in 2015, interestingly, 2015 seems to have been a banner year for these things. The Chronicle of Higher Education published a special issue about transgender in post-secondary contexts. It's really accessible. Both you can just find it online easily, and it's not research writing per se. And I'd like to say that a lot has changed in the last 5 years, but I think a lot of what's in that issue actually still applies. It's still relevant. I'd also suggest looking at an article written by my colleague Katja Tima and me, and the article that we wrote, you wrote, but that was about my class. And there was this other article that my colleague Katja Tima and I wrote, which is called "How Do You Wish to Be Cited? Citation Practices and a Scholarly Community of Queer and Trans Studies Research Articles." That was published in the Journal of English for Academic Purposes. And while it's not specifically concerned with trans-related pedagogies, our bibliography includes a lot of pertinent materials there. So anyone who found that article, if they looked through the reference list, would find a lot of material that could be helpful. And the last thing I would suggest right now, and I'll try and send you a list of these so you can include them in the video, but the final thing I'd suggest looking at right now is an article that was published in the Chronicle of Higher Education just this past April. It's called COVID-19 Sent LGBTQ Students Back to Unsupportive Homes. That raises the risk they won't return. And so while the article is about LGBTQ students broadly, it does speak about trans students specifically and the often unstable and unsafe home lives they experience, where universities and colleges, even with all of their shortcomings around trans inclusion, may feel safer than home. I think it's a really important article to read, in part because it reminds us of our responsibility as educators to make our institutions as safe as possible for those students.
Thank you so much, Mary Ann. It's been a real joy to connect with you again, and an honour to be able to include you in this video series at UQ.
To finish up, I'd like to summarise the results of my research with Mary Ann's class, because it speaks to the benefits of incorporating trans studies into non-specialist courses, and particularly in this case, the academic research and writing course, but also because it leads us towards some of the things that instructors might consider with their own courses. Firstly, 97% of Mary Ann's students reported having learned about academic research and writing in her course. And that's great, because those were the intended learning outcomes of the course, and no surprise, because Mary Ann's a really fabulous instructor. But the point here is that this result was comparable to the results for courses where there was a different course topic area. Secondly, 68% of students in Mary Ann's course reported having used that new knowledge, having already used that new knowledge about research and writing in their other courses. And again, this is something that the course set out to do, to provide knowledge that could be transferred to other contexts. This is a lower percentage, 68 compared to 97, but the point here is that the students completed this survey before the assessment tasks in their other courses had actually fallen due. So to think that they'd already used the new knowledge before the end of semester was a really great result. And Mary Ann's class lined up exactly along the same lines as instructors, as students and instructors who'd adopted other course topic areas. So the point here is that building trans content into this non-specialist course had no negative effect on the student learning outcomes that were required for success in the actual course. But in addition to meeting the research and writing learning objectives of this course, Mary Ann's students also learned about transgender issues and perspectives. As the quotation on the bottom of this screen points out, they're essentially getting 2 courses in. In our first semester of data collection, Mary Ann's students spontaneously mentioned learning about the course topic area, that is, it wasn't a specific survey question, more often than students in most of the other classes. Only students in classes dealing with disability, self-control, human rights, and medicine mentioned learning about the topic area more often than Mary Ann's students. And there were probably another dozen topic areas which ranked lower on this point than Mary Ann's students. 27% of students in Mary Ann's course wrote about having used that new knowledge about the course topic area, about transgender studies, outside the context of the course. And as you can see from some of the quotations on the screen, this was in a positive, favourable, affirming direction. Now, apart from teaching the same course for 7 years, one of the things that Mary Ann and I have in common is that we both approach teaching with a strong social reform perspective. This means we're highly motivated to help learners recognise the values and ideologies that underpin aspects of the world around us, and to use education as a means towards building a better world. Now, if you're an educator and you've never heard of Dan Pratt's Teaching Perspectives Inventory, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's been used around the world for nearly 20 years. And even if you don't like survey-based research and typologies, I found that it was a good way to reflect critically on my teaching philosophy. And during my research, Mary Ann shared with me that she has 4 specific social reform goals that underpin her decision to embed trans studies in her non-specialist courses. Firstly, embedding trans studies in non-specialist courses is one way to counter a general lack of institutional support for trans students. So even if there are no dedicated subjects, and even if support services are thin on the ground, embedding this material into required courses or courses that students are taking anyway is one way, not the only way, but one way to address a lack of support. Secondly, it can help students to understand that media representations of trans people and trans issues are typically reductive and dehumanising ways of seeing trans lives. And it also helps students to see that trans lives are much more complex and varied than the media would suggest. The third goal, and also accomplishment of Mary Ann's work, is to invite students to reflect on their own positioning in relation to trans issues. And Mary Ann tells me that most of the students enter her class knowing very little about trans people and trans lives beyond what they get from the media. So breaking down these reductionistic stereotypes is very important. Some students have confessed to Mary Ann at the end of the course that when it started, they really didn't want to be taking that course with that topic area because of their own prejudice against trans people. But one effect of the course has been, and this is students' reports, that it caused them to engage with and question their own preconceptions, which is fabulous. Other students took Mary Ann's course because they'd not yet come out to anyone, and students have told Mary Ann that they chose her particular version of this academic research and writing course precisely so that they could, and they came out to Mary Ann for the first time. Finally, embedding trans studies in non-specialist courses can raise student awareness not only of trans people's lives and the issues that they face, but also of trans scholarship and epistemology. And epistemology, in case you're not familiar with that word, just means knowledge making. Trans studies is an activist form of scholarship. It centres on transgender forms of knowledge and knowledge making, rather than allowing cisgender knowledge and knowledge making to function as a supposedly neutral or default position. So this goal involves teaching students that they have responsibilities in relation to their research material, particularly if they're researching marginalised or disenfranchised populations, not only trans people. Now, this is a list of just a few research paper titles of projects completed in Mary Ann's class, and it shows that the topics students are exploring ranges far more widely than just questions about bathroom use, which we see so much of in the media. And it shows that her students are exploring aspects of their own diverse lives and experiences in relation to the lives of transgender people. For example, just a couple of points that are not on the slide. One student from Nigeria took Mary Ann's course because she has a gay brother who is still in Nigeria where it's illegal to be gay, and she thought there might be something she could learn in the course to help him. Christian, Muslim, and Jewish students have all done research projects on the place of trans people within their own religious traditions. A music student did her project on a transgender concert pianist and professor of piano performance at the UBC School of Music. And other students who identify as gamers have worked on trans participation, representation, and inclusion in the world of video games. All of these projects help students appreciate that trans people are, in Mary Ann's words, in addition to anything else they may be, people whose lives and aspirations and interests are not that different from the student's own. It also positions students to ask questions about the struggles and prejudice and exclusion that trans people face every day. This excerpt on the screen here is a wonderful example of one of Mary Ann's students' research proposals that shows that at least some students, and as early as first year, are coming to grips with trans epistemology and their own responsibilities as researchers.
There are many ways to transgender the academy through the curriculum. Some very simple adjustments include selecting course readings that address the experience of trans people, mentioning transgender examples in class discussions about a wide variety of topics, using appropriate terminology in relation to sex and gender, and inviting students to identify their preferred name and pronoun usage. It's also important, obviously, for instructors to avoid not only disclosing students' sexual orientation without consent, but also, and this is something Mary Ann pointed out, I really appreciate her insight here, not silencing students who might, in good faith, make problematic statements as they learn about gender and sexual diversity. By paying attention and acting accordingly in these areas, instructors have the potential to normalise gender and sexual minority experience and to raise straight and cisgender students' privilege awareness. Thanks for listening.